Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I saw that we have at least 73 registrants for this webinar, which is a really good number for this particular activity that we do. Welcome to the first webinar in the annual Animal Science Research Webinar Series. This webinar series is the vision of the members of the Animal Science Committee for the National Pork Board. Its purpose is to identify and highlight completed research projects that have direct on-farm application, then increase the dissemination of those results, of those projects through this WebEx platform. It's also the vision of the Animal Science Committee that this will be an annual event so that in years to come, producers know that each Tuesday at 12 p.m. Central during the month of August, they can attend a webinar and get updated on completed research projects that were supported by checkoff funds. So you can feel free to mark your calendars for 2019 now. Well, this year's webinar series follows a general theme of improving sow lifetime productivity. Today, the webinar will be presented by Dr. John Deen. Dr. Deen is a professor of animal health and welfare at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. He earned his DVM, Master's, and PhD in the veterinary epidemiology at the University of Guelph in Ontario. His areas of interest include swine health and welfare, epidemiology of swine diseases, international development. Dr. Deen gained board certification in swine health management from the American Board of Veterinary Practitioners in '94, and he is a member of the Swine Welfare Committee at the National Pork Board as well as the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. He's also the member of a steering committee for the American College of Animal Welfare and a board member of the Professional Animal Audit Certification Organization. So today, the title of Dr. Deen's presentation is When Sows Leave Too Soon. I've asked him to give this talk because of the research in this area that he was involved with back in the early 2000s. I think there's a lot to be learned from reviewing history. A much wiser man than I actually commented on that at one point of time. But much of the results that he's presenting today will set the stage for the next 3 speakers in this webinar series. So if you've not already registered for those webinars, please do so. It's going to be a good webinar series for you. Also, we are recording this webinar, so within a day or two, we'll post the link of that recording. It'll be at the same page that you go to for registering, and you can share that webinar with people that weren't able to view it at this time. Also, at that location you can find a link that will take you to previous animal science webinars. Currently, there are 16 recorded webinars in that library, and these webinars are on a variety of topics. So at the end of Dr. Deen's presentation, we'll have some time for question and answers. Please type your questions into the chat box, which is located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Those questions will come directly to me, and then I will relay your questions to John for his response. Of course, you don't have to wait until the end of the webinar to ask questions. You can feel free to send them to me as they occur to you. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Deen.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thank you to the National Pork Board as well as the Animal Science Committee for this opportunity. As Chris mentioned, this goes back a number of years back into the stacks as far as some of the research on the epidemiology of sow mortality and longevity that we did in the past, and I hope it sets a stage for some of the discussions that are going to occur this month on this subject, and also introduce some of the initiatives that are now being pursued by the National Pork Board. So diving into it, probably the first slide I made of sow mortality was something I called Sow Attrition, taking the records of sows and simply asking what proportion of sows survive a parity, and if our aim is to actually produce sows that will create 6 or even 7 litters, what proportion of the herd actually does that? And frankly, the number surprises us. And in addition, this number really hasn't changed over time within this industry in the last 10 to 15 years. I've introduced it in some cases as a product failure. The idea that we buy gilts and introduce sows with the intent of getting 6 litters and having 20, 30, maybe 40% of the sows actually meeting that aim is not only significant criticism on our practices or our decisions, but also it should be seen as a real opportunity for improvement. The other point that can be made with this is it does vary quite a bit from herd to herd as far as the profile of this attrition curve, and also sometimes from season to season, especially if we have a deficit of gilts. Oops, skipped one slide there. Saying that, mortality has a real challenge in its study. It's a relatively infrequent event until the herd size gets quite large. And so there's many other concerns and challenges in a herd. And so that longevity and mortality are often secondary to meeting breeding target, to making sure the sows get fed, to making sure that repairs occur. And so when you are up to your neck in alligators, it's hard to remember the original objective was to drain the swamp. Saying that as well, we have to recognize that it can be a failure of a wide number of areas in the pig or in the sow. Only one part has to fail to cause either reason for culling or for mortality. And we're seeing that right now with our challenges in pelvic organ prolapses. And we don't really have a lot of choices as far as fixing gilts and sows when they do have problems. Challenges as well are that our means of rearing pigs, the scenarios in which we make our production targets, the genotypes that we have varied a lot over time. And those changes have introduced new challenges into pig production as well. I'm one of the old guys who can remember when sow mortality was a very infrequent event, that in my days growing up in the 60s and 70s, 1 sow a year in a 100 sow herd was pretty common, and trying to remember when a sow died was often a point of discussion within different sow herds. And so that has changed. And I think we need to realize that part of that change has been due to the fact that we have different expectations for our sows. Survival looks difficult sometimes when we go out into extensive operations, but in fact, some of our intensive practices and our selection pressures have created different challenges. And I'm going to share some of those as well. Underneath all of it, and I should correct the biography, it's a few years old. I'm a member of the American College of Animal Welfare, and one of the terms we use in terms of welfare and biological capability is simply asking, is the sow coping? And we have behavioral indicators where there is difficulty. The sow may not be interacting correctly with the floor, with the air if it's too hot. Other sows where there's agonistic behavior. It can be inflammatory processes, whether it be infectious disease or infection due to injury. It can be competition for feed or for water, but all of those can indicate a sow that has having some difficulty in its environment. We can cut open sows. We can take a look at the outside of sows and look at their pathology. We can look at injuries. We can look for those inflammatory responses. We can measure fevers that are going on in the animal. We can also look at the productivity numbers, look directly at culling rates, at non-productive sow days, at litter size and challenges of litter survival and the carcass composition of those litters. And all of these can create challenges for our sows. We can talk about tough sows and simply view every sow that we bring into the herd as having the capabilities to meet all those challenges. But I think our attrition numbers suggest otherwise. This may be self-evident, but go along with me in taking a look at some of the reasons. So why did the sow die? It couldn't cope with the challenges set before it. It could be because it wasn't culled before it died. It could be, and we'll discuss it, in fact, because it farrowed and it has a certain set of reproductive challenges. It can have other reproductive priorities coming back into heat. It can have longevity risks or challenges to longevity. In some cases, they're unpredictable, such as a prolapse or an injury to injury or fracture to a leg. In some cases, they're more predictable, that we see a problem developing over time, such as lameness. But frankly, in most cases, where there is a predictable process going on within that sow to get to the point that she either needs to be culled or dies, there's usually a combination of factors of hot weather, lameness, low feed intake, and these factors together are actually multiplicative. And that's one of the things we studied and learned over time, over the last 15 years, is that it's these ongoing challenges that combine and create a challenge within the herd. Of course, a sow is based on a skeletal structure with muscles and other systems around it. And I just want to point out that time after time, we need to remember that a sow is walking on a hard surface, essentially on its equivalent of our fingernails. The extension of the limbs so that it comes down to, if we look at ourselves, 3 fingers, it is a tentative position for a sow and a pig to be in terms of being comfortable within its environment, but it helps it move faster. Also have to point out that reproduction is a major challenge for a sow. In previous studies, we found that approximately 2.6% of sows that enter a farrowing crate die before leaving the farrowing crate. And so we're talking about that 1 in 40 mortality that we're often seeing. And in some cases, it has increased with other increases in pathologies, such as pelvic organ prolapses. If you take that number out, approximately 61% of total mortality is in that periparturient period, during that time when the sow is in the farrowing crate, either getting ready to farrow or lactating afterwards. If you take it on a day-by-day basis, we see that the daily risk of mortality is 7 times higher during this time frame than during gestation. We can graph that out as well, and as we see here, we have a very high peak as far as proportion of mortality occurring in those first few days post-farrowing. And then if we go out and actually go out to 135 days, we see another peak, and this is the pre-farrowing group of sows that occur in this record. At least that's our assumption, because it follows on a parity cycle. And though we don't have a farrowing record with those sows around 135 days, it fits quite well. The other thing about farrowing crates is that they're the sows are very dependent on feed intake. Former postdoc of mine, Sukumaran Anil, studied feed intake during lactation. And what we found, for instance, is low feed intake around that 0.5 or even 1 kilogram in a day almost doubled, or in fact did result in a doubling of the odds of removal before producing another litter. This includes mortality and culling and euthanasia. And so a single day off feed ends up being a major challenge to the sow. And in part that's due to the fact that if we take a look at the physical demands upon a sow, there's very few species that put as much of its body mass into a litter over a short period of time. We found that mice are a comparable and actually more challenging place for lactation. And actually, harbor seals is another species. But compared to a dairy cow, or most of our other, or all of our other domestic farm species, we don't see a comparable lactational demand over a short period of time, which really suggests that feed intake day after day during lactation is a major factor in coping with the demands upon the sow. Saying that, part of my memory of managing sows before modern European types is that we didn't have that problem in the 1960s and 1970s when we had some of our tougher genotypes. And I think part of that reason is my memory is, if they didn't eat, they stopped lactating and they dried up. And if they were skinny at weaning, they didn't come into estrus, and we had to wait for some time to get condition back on. And I think part of the challenge is we've created mechanisms, including genetic selection, to keep sows lactating and breeding in the face of some of these metabolic and, in some cases, other challenges. Seasonality, of course, is a major factor in predicting mortality rates. We see those peaks year after year, at least in our temperate climates, where we have higher mortality, often in the range of approximately a 40% increase during peaks. And again, shouldn't be that surprising, but as we looked into those seasonal factors in more detail, we found that it was actually the overnight low temperatures that are more of a predictor than the hot days. When we're not in the barn, or at least most of us, we need to remember that cooling the sows so that they can compensate for the hot days is a real challenge. And up here in Minnesota, we've had particular challenges. An article from our local newspaper pointed out that we've had the hottest nighttime temperatures ever, at least up to July 14. And in fact, it was 2 degrees on average warmer than it's ever been in the recorded weather patterns. Oops. Another factor shown time after time to predict mortality, of course, is stillbirths. And we've followed that over time, especially when a large proportion of the litter dies. We see an increase in likelihood of mortality as well. We also then looked at gestational mortality and overall mortality and found some other patterns as well. We do see differences, at least in the past, by parity, with a relatively small amounts of data in 7th and 8th parity, but there was a slow climb after a slightly higher level of mortality in gills. And that pattern has been seen over probably about 2.5 million parity records. But before we make too much out of that, we should also take a look at the proportion of mortality by parity as a function of the overall mortality. And time after time, because of the parity distribution in our herds, most of that mortality exists in the lower parities. And that is the area to not only emphasize for the sake of longevity, but simply to emphasize for controlling mortality as well. So we have these challenges in creating a population that can live long, and not only live long, but prosper and be productive. And I always wonder if I'm aging myself too much by quoting Spock, but I will point out that not only was that his sign and his saying, but he was also the one who emphasized that for the sake of many, he needed to sacrifice some aspects as well. Probably emphasizing too much of an old part. So let's take a look at some other risk factors. Number one is that lameness is involved time after time. But I want to emphasize the measurement of lameness in a different manner than you normally see. The problem with lameness is it's usually measured at time of death or culling. And it is a major factor, often involving somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% of sows. But when we look at it prospectively, when we take a look at sows that are entering the farrowing crate, controlling for the other factors, lame sows entering a farrowing crate had a 40% higher odds of dying. Many people ask how difficult is it to identify those lame sows, and my argument is it's not at all. We simply ask whoever is moving the sows to identify those that are lame. And using a simple lame, non-lame categorization gives us a much better understanding of some of the factors involved in survivability in the herd. We looked at conditions such as acclimatizing to the farrowing crate, in other words, number of days in the farrowing crate before farrowing, and we saw no effect if we controlled, if we took into account the gestation length that affects some of that. We studied back fat, and interestingly enough, sow condition scores were a better predictor of mortality than back fat. Many people have asked why, and I think that sow condition scoring as well as lameness scoring is not a blind, pure measurement. Instead, a lousy looking sow that is condition scored or rated for lameness rates more poorly than a sow that looks healthy. And I think sometimes we're embedding other factors in there. We also looked at obstetrical interventions and frequency, the duration of farrowing. We did not see an effect upon mortality except that which is predicted by stillbirths. And it could be that the duration of farrowing and the interventions that were the factor, but stillbirths ends up being the more easily measured predictor. Lameness can be due to problems with joints, with bones, and with claws. And beyond lameness, we've done quite a bit taking a look at claw lesions and understanding it as a predictor to subsequent mortality. and culling likelihood. And lesions such as this, a vertical wall crack with a great deal of abrasion on the surface of the claw, has been one of our largest predictors of mortality and culling that often has not entered into record-keeping systems or even been measured at time of culling and removal from the herd. Interestingly enough, it's also a predictor of poor reproductive performance, and that combination is often the reason we see sows being removed. Saying that, when we talk about lameness, we also need to recognize that we do not see all sows that are lame. A student of mine, Supat Watsanapansak, actually did a study of videoing sows during feeding in a pen system and classifying them as lame and non-lame, and then blindly also classifying them as lame and non-lame during movement into the farrowing crate. And when we did that, there was a large group of sows that, in this case, 9 sows that were lame as seen on the video, but were non-lame when moved to the farrowing crate. And this is a common characteristic in pursued animals or historically pursued animals, where hiding behavior is used to keep them from being chosen to be eaten. And we've seen it time after time that the prevalence is higher if we measure sow herds by video than by having people involved with movement. So you've got more of a problem. We've done estimates of the effects of lameness and its effect upon the productivity and profitability of the sow herd. We've seen decreases in salvage value for sows. We've seen increases in replacement costs, decreased output. In this case of the sow space, not of the sow, was a major loss due to lameness, and the value of output due to lower weaning weights was also seen. And so lameness alone, a simple lesion, can be predicted in this case to be $170, and as weaned pig prices go up, that price goes up. And again, to emphasize, and I'm taking lameness as a major factor, others will take other areas, but non-infectious diseases, we see that when we take a look at the cross-section, that sows are in fact walking on their tippy toes. And that relationship between the floor and the skeletal structure of the pig is actually quite a sensitive area that needs to be studied in more detail. The other thing we did, and this goes a bit deeper and something that we're studying in more detail right now, is taking a look at the breeding group mortality rates rather than individual sow rates. We're looking at what happens from breeding group to breeding group. And we see, first of all, that as the sows get older in a breeding group, we've seen a higher mortality rate, almost 1% higher in those breeding groups. As gilt pool size at weaning of the sows going into a breeding group, we see that a larger gilt pool size is actually protective. And as the number of sows in breeding group increases, we also see a decrease in mortality rates. And this is a challenge for us to understand. And the best opportunity, or the best explanation simply is that we're retaining sows when under pressure out of the rebreeds, out of the weaned sows that would not be retained if we have enough sows to meet breeding target. And so even our summer increase in mortality rates appears to be partly explained by the fact that we're retaining different kinds of sows to make up that breeding group. And understanding the pressures of keeping sows and of culling sows under different scenarios, and the fact that culling can actually be protective against mortality rate is something we're trying to understand in more detail. So what should we avoid? To put it somewhat facetiously, a sow should avoid getting pregnant. And the same has been true among humans in many cases, that pregnancy is actually a risk factor. But on the other hand, what is the one thing sows should do to avoid culling is getting pregnant. And really, as we talk about longevity and separate mortality and culling, we know that culling can be protective, but is culling always successful? And really, we don't often have a test for that. And the challenge is understanding that if we don't cull, we see our failures, but if we do cull, we don't know what would be the future productivity and survivability of sows that we do cull. And understanding that in more detail is also a challenge in the future. But I'm going to step out and make a few observations. Number one is that we rarely understand culling rate as a combination of successful culls and unsuccessful culls. If we have a sow that's at a planned productive age, let's say six litters, without a history of reproductive failure, without welfare concerns, we sell her at full sale value, we sell her at time of weaning, and with a replacement ready, that is a successful cull, and we should be celebrating them and not being critical of those. And understanding that less than 10% of culls in most herds meet these categories is something that we should use as a target in improving the survivability of our reproductive herd. We should also understand what unsuccessful culls are. We, in one term, culling to avoid mortality and morbidity is successful, but it's indicative of challenges to sows that we should be controlling and studying in more detail. We need to also understand that when we're culling to avoid poor productivity, it's usually based on a prior reproductive history, but in fact, there's usually an underlying pathology that is driving that reproductive history. Often it's inflammation. We've seen claw inflammation result in a poor reproductive output. We've seen infectious diseases cause some of those cases as well. But we need to understand the drivers in more cases. And we need to understand unsuccessful culls often are culls in error. When we have culling occurring, when the replacements and frankly their progeny as well don't do better on average than what we would do if we kept the sow, we've had an error in culling. And some of those measures need to occur in more detail. So what can we do to improve survivability? I'm going to make a few suggestions based on previous research and also just on some of our understanding of processes in sows. We need to understand, as I mentioned, pathology better and not use sow cards as much to make decisions on culling. Understand that when a sow has a problem that is physically seen, often suggested through lameness scores or through sow condition, that may be a better predictor and often is a better predictor than the sow card and the historic reproductive capability. We need to improve conformation to reduce pathology, and that's being discussed more and more, that the selection of gilt can result in less problems in lameness and other factors. And for other factors, my recommendation based on what we've worked on in the past is to record things up front and then follow the sows and see how they perform. We've seen lameness as not only a major cause of mortality and reproductive failure, we've seen it as about the only cause of reproductive failure in some herds. We need to understand off-feed events, why they occur, what factors are in play in the farrowing crate. We need to understand where antibiotics work, and even more importantly, if inflammation is a major factor in some of our longevity issues, where we can start introducing anti-inflammatories into regular decisions. Evaluating culling strategies, of course, is a major challenge as well. So I've used up my time, and I thank you very much for the summary. I look forward to the other presentations this month, and I think we have some time for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. That was a good presentation on a very important topic for productivity and profitability of our pork producers. So just a reminder to everybody, I've had a few questions come in to me, but if you type your question into the chat box down in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and direct those to me, then I can relay them to John. So just a first question that came in was, of the indicators of coping, which would be the most comprehensive?
Wow, that's a good question. I think what I'm trying to emphasize right now is understanding in the farrowing crate, sows getting up, drinking, eating, and getting down as far as behavior. The ability to do that quickly after farrowing and do it on a regular basis. And understanding that movement and that decision and that ability to manage that behavior, I think is going to become more important.
Yeah, those farms where they stimulate sows to get up and eat several times a day probably have a lower mortality rate because of that. Yeah, there's some, and frankly, we're just getting into more individual sow data, whether it be through motion detectors, accelerometers, and the like, and we're getting to see a strong biological relationship between motion or behavior or activity and survivability. So Tom Petstick types in, is there any data that suggests size of gilt pool and percent selected from the pool is an indicator of future lameness issues? It would seem intuitive, but curious if any hard data is out there. I don't know of any data associated with that, but maybe you do, John.
I remember one paper, and it's, again, I think it's probably around 15, 20 years old, by Karina Taranti, who looked at selection pressure, in other words, selecting less and the effect upon survivability, and she showed a relationship. And so it was sort of a first pass, second pass selection criteria, but not much more.
I've actually been curious about that from my own personal standpoint, that as we dive deeper into that available gilt pool, what percentage of those females fall out earlier and earlier? So in other words, if we're at 50% selection rate in our gilt pool, we probably got a 5% mortality associated with those 50%. But the next 25%, if we dive in deeper and take out 25% more females from the available gilt pool, there's probably a 10% mortality rate associated with those females. They die at a higher rate. I don't know that that research has been done, but that would kind of get to this question that was asked.
Yeah, the Taranti paper did some of it, but I think it's an internal experiment that can be done really easily. And I'll reiterate, if we start recording factors when they're measured and then follow forward in our record-keeping system, we'll get a better idea of that. And frankly, we do have varying demands upon that gill pool to meet production targets. And I think it would be pretty easy to test that.
Yeah. Got another question here. How much emphasis do you recommend to be placed on maintenance of proper parity distribution?
I always get in trouble on that one, to be honest.
Yeah.
I say none.
Yeah.
The proper parity distribution is to have all the sows last in the herd until they leave at 7th parity or 6th parity or whatever your target is. And I've never seen it done very well, and it catches up with ourselves. That's many people have contradicted me on that, however.
Yeah. Yeah, it strikes me that graph that you showed about, parity and the mortality associated with parity. It didn't strike me that there was a whole lot of, incline until you get out there to the past 6 parity. So perhaps it's not as associated with, parity is not as associated with mortality as some people would think that it is.
Yeah, I probably overstated that. I think we should aim to keep as many of our sows as possible during the first 2 parities and make it an aim to reduce losses during those first 2 parities, and then things straighten out in the herd pretty quickly. And I'd go so far as saying that probably in the great majority of herds, the predictiveness of litter size and of returns isn't high enough to justify culling on those bases. Instead, I would simply cull on the basis of pathology.
So another question here is, since lameness is a major cause of mortality, how has group housing contributed to overall sow mortality?
And many of us have seen it, and actually it was the driving factor to start lameness research in this group by the fact that group housing, especially on slatted floors with electronic sow feeders, resulted in an increase in lameness. And so we've learned to compensate for that, and various studies have shown factors such as more solid floor space, alternate and less competitive feeding styles, change in some cases in genotype, better selection has met some of that challenge to reduce lameness.
Yeah, I think that's some good suggestions for, just simply managing those females in group housing different than what we would typically have managed them in the past, and those are some good suggestions. Okay, so, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, one thing I forgot and has come up in a number of times in our analyses of lameness in group situations has been fighting, agonistic behavior. In other words, where we've seen an increase in fighting, either due to initial mixing or especially afterwards due to competing for entry into a feeding stall, we've seen more lameness as well. And I think there's been some changes over time in behavior.
Yeah, yeah. Another question is, in a parity target range, does spacing out the parity cycle help reduce mortality? I'm not sure I quite understand that question, so if you can clarify that, but maybe John understands it better than I do.
I'm not sure. The spacing out the parity cycle, lengthening at one point is lengthening the average parity cycle, if that's the interpretation, giving sows more time to acclimatize and less pressures. It may. I haven't had a lot of experience with that, to be honest.
Yeah. Another question is there any data on comparison of sow mortality on conventional housing sows versus loose housing sows?
We did some of it early at University of Minnesota and reported that there was a difference with loose housing sows, saying that it was a particular flooring type, a particular genotype, and it was with electronic sow feeders. And so I would simply answer that under those conditions, definitely. But as we've refined some of those methods, it's gotten a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you in that regard. I think that a lot of that work was done early there at Minnesota to kind of identify, some of those challenges associated with it. So a question here then is, how does stocking density in gestation influence mortality or fallouts? Is there an optimal square feet per sow or pregnant gill? I think there's some of that information available, right?
Yep, yeah. I guess I'd give two answers. Number one is optimal, sort of a funny number. In other words, it suggests there's a number of factors in play on that decision. And so I'm not sure there's an optimal, but there is a point, and I would argue it depends on frame size and the like. And there's a number of publications out there that look at different sizes and the like and give stocking density recommendations. And some of that's coming out in the Swine Care Handbook as well. I just can't recall what number is in there. And so that's important. I think the other factor is that we also need to take a look at our removals and additions into groups, going back to some of that agonistic or in some cases calling it simply fighting can result in lameness as well. And we've seen some of those challenges based on group size, with smaller group size, that there's less ability to stabilize a group with mixing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those numbers are out there. I think, like you said, the Swine Welfare Guide, I think would be one resource for producers to look up. So then just a general comment here from one of our participants. Many genetics companies have promoted excessive parity distribution management. This has resulted in reduced average parity and less lifetime productivity. So I think that's a pretty insightful comment on their part.
Yeah, no, and that can be argued two ways. I think with some of the newer models on payment for genetic inputs, some of that has been reduced. I think that the other factor, and we can put it into calculations for sow turnover, and I have a hard time identifying it on maternal lines, is how much do we lose by having sows around for 2 years with genetic advancement. And there's been some of that, I think more in the progeny than in the sows, but that can be a factor. But again, it shouldn't really affect survivability in the first couple parities. Sure.
I think Ken Stalder did some of that work maybe in about 2007 or 2008 with a pork board funded project where he looked at genetic merit and the loss of value. And I think he found the break point was at about parity 7 or parity 8, something like that. It was where the improved genetics would actually catch up to the old sow being in the herd. So if anybody else has any questions or comments, you can direct them to me after the webinar is over here. Just send them to me by email. I'd like to thank Dr. Deen for kicking off this 2018 Animal Science Research webinars. But his presentation was excellent and spot on, and it gives us a lot of good information about what we know about mortality and premature culling. I guess for me, the 4 takeaways from this presentation is proper nutrition, right around the peri-parchment phase, and particularly with respect to intake, but also feeding to body condition scores is extremely important. I would also say that assisted farrowings is important to reduce those stillborn pigs so that sow mortality is lowered. Genetic selection and or robustness is something that has changed over the last few years. And then, of course, we talked a lot about culling selectivity and doing it with intention being extremely important. So those are my 4 things that I've taken away. I hope producers have taken a lot more away from this presentation than I did. But I think his presentation sets the stage for the remaining presentations in this series. Please remember that there are 3 more webinars. Next Tuesday, Dr. Clay Lentz will discuss the results of his research project on the effect of gilt body composition on lifetime productivity. On the 21st of August, Dr. George Foxcroft from University of Alberta will present information on a project that he conducted on how best to manage gilts and the effect of litter of origin has on sow productivity. And finally, the series will conclude on August 28th with Dr. Jason Ross from Iowa State. He will talk about a research project that he's been working on over the last 8 months or so to identify potential causes for pelvic organ prolapse in sows. If you're not yet registered for these webinars, please remember to do so by going to pork.org and then navigating to the animal science page from there. I hope you found this information presented today to be useful, improving profitability of your enterprise, and I look forward to seeing you in next week's webinar. Thank you.